I'm very happy to have you all here with us today. We will be discussing the topic of the second wave of uprisings, if you want to call it this way. We will have two case studies, one on Algeria presented by Naoual and one on Sudan by Sarah. And the idea is to discuss comparisons between the first and the second wave, but maybe also interconnectedness of the wave. So we'll first have a presentation by Naoual Belakhdar, who is a political scientist at the Free University of Berlin. And her focus is on social movements and statehood in post-colonial Maghreb and Mashriq, with a particular focus on political participation, protest, and resistance movements, as well as on collective memory, film, and politics. So her dissertation is on the transformation of state-society relations in post-Civil War Algeria. And her latest publication, exactly on the topic she will be talking today, is L'indépendance, c'est maintenant, réflexion sur le soulèvement populaire en Algérie, just published with l'année du Maghreb last year, 2019.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to the whole Nawara team. I'm very glad the opportunity to enter into a dialogue with so many excellent scholars, and in the first place with Sarah Abbas. I think it's also great that we can talk about ongoing revolutions in this strange context of international pandemia. So yeah, I'm glad that we will talk about positive things like revolutions and ongoing struggles today. In my short presentation, I would like to focus on Algeria, of course, and to contextualize the emergence of the revolutionary upheaval Hirak into the contemporary political history of Algeria and put it into perspective with the 2011 moment. Thereby, I will try to show this movement is embedded in different political temporalities, and this will allow me to shed light on how it draws on past failures, but also on lessons learned. Okay, so let me start. Since February 2019, as you know, Algeria witnessed an unprecedented popular upheaval that started with the opposition to a fifth mandate of ailing President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was in power since 1999, but suffered a stroke in 2013, which left him unable to speak, and this revived questions of who's de facto the country. So following the official announcement of his intention to run for mandate, despite his poor health, protests erupted in several small towns like Renchla, Rata, across the whole, and culminate later in massive unprecedented demonstrations on the 22nd of February across the whole national territory, and most noteworthy in the capital Algiers, where protests were strictly forbidden since 2001. So why are these protests surprising? Although post-colonial Algeria has a long and rich history of social and political protest, these demonstrations were unprecedented in terms of their scope. So in the first weeks, we were talking about millions of people in the streets in terms of their cross-class, cross-gender, and cross-generational character, but also graphical distribution. And I think it's very interesting and novel that we've seen massive demonstrations, as I told you, in big cities in the north, but also very small demonstrations in border cities like Tamanrasset at the border with Mali, for example, where we had only 10 people going out, but still they were in the streets and they were participating in this movement. I think the perseverance of the movement is equally noteworthy, despite the diverse regime's attempts to divide it and to repress it by persecuting and imprisoning activists and demonstrators. So after 13 months of uninterrupted mobilizations, mainly on Fridays and Tuesdays, only the corona pandemics brought the protest movement to a temporary halt because citizens called upon the sense of responsibility in light of failing healthcare infrastructure. So in a sense, the Hirak is ongoing, but it's in suspension. Although unexpectedness lies in the nature of revolutionary upheavals, one element that contributed to the surprise was the fact that in 2011, while the Arab world was demonstrations against the system failed in Algeria. Then Algeria faced a structural crisis at the social level, high youth unemployment, sharpened authoritarianism, and widespread popular discontent. So the most plausible explanations back then were the strong distribution capacities of the regime and its ability to, I quote, buy social peace. Although I have a problem with this explanation, but I think this was dominant. In addition, what also played a role was the lack of credibility of the oppositional class that called for the anti-system demonstrations, and most importantly, also the civil war trauma. The fear of falling into chaos and violence was later then alimented by the dramatic turn that the Syrian and Libyan uprisings embarked on. Thus, in 2011, a deep sense of bitterness and frustration prevailed among activist circles and ordinary citizens who were hoping for a change to come. I remember that I was in Algiers in February 2011, and I was attending an attempt to demonstration. It was on a Friday, and it was interesting that there were actually more bystanders who were skeptically looking at the demonstrators than actual demonstrators. And when I asked a man who was in his 50s why he didn't join the protest, he told me with a mixture of regret and bitterness, we already had our revolution, in reference to the October 88 youth revolt that led to a political opening, but ended up in the 90s, the life of more than 200,000 citizens, and left 8,000 disappeared between 1992 and 2000. Thus, 2011, from an Algerian perspective, was a moment where the question of the individual and collective trauma brutally reappeared in the public sphere, where questions of disunity, fragmentation, the incapacity to fight together were discussed, looking back at the 88 revolts as another instance of failure and confiscation of collective sacrifices, as it had already struggled for independence. So how can we now explain the sudden outbreak of mass protest? I won't go into details, but I will just mention 2 or 3 points. The most obvious explanation was, of course, the feeling of indignation, of outrage, of shame, after Bouteflika's announcement that he would run for a 5th mandate, despite his obvious physical incapacity to do so. This announcement acted like a moral shock in the sense of Jaspers. Yet, if this announcement acted like a catalyst, the reasons for the upheaval are, of course, deeper and result from a multidimensional crisis of the political system, from the transformations of the Algerian society and the deterioration of the social situation. Overall, we can say that the symbolic and material legitimation resources of the regime were exhausted. Interestingly, the movement was launched by anonymous calls that circulated on the internet, which strangely recalls the beginning of the October 88 nationwide youth riot. Yet, contrary to the founding moment of Algerian pluralism that was characterized by violence against symbols of the regime and a brutal repression by the army that cost the life of around 500 young protesters, the movement of the 22nd of February is inherently peaceful, like the watchword Selmiya shows. This is indeed an important aspect, since the self-restraint and the peaceful repertoire is framed as a lesson learned from past failed experiences on the national level, but also on the regional level. In addition, it thus breaks with Orientalistic stereotypes about the inherently violent Algerian society that only knows the language of violence, and it conjured the fear of falling into chaos. I think that without reproducing gender stereotypes, that this Selmiya, this peacefulness, is simultaneously the effect, but also the reason of a massive presence of women and families or members from different generations. But of course, it should also be mentioned that the peaceful character results from the lack of lethal repression. So of course, when we look at the Syrian example or the Libyan example, violence was only the result of regime violence. So as it's already been underlined by scholars like Meha Abdurrahman, Jack Goldstone, Jenny Clark, with reference to the Arab upheavals in 2011, the reason for the success of this mass mobilization was the junction between the middle class with urban popular classes. Although the youth was overwhelmingly present in the demonstration, the parts of all types of generation and the lack of an explicit ideological orientation were a decisive factor for the long duration of the coalition. Similar to what we could observe during the first wave of Arab Revolution, this upheaval was also characterized by its horizontal character and the absence of a centralized leadership, or rather by the multitude of leaders and organizations. So indeed, we observed a multitude of local networks on the level of neighborhoods, among friends, families, and activists who played a major role, not least for the circulation of information, the provision of security, health, and food during demonstration and beyond. On the contrary, one of the characteristics of the current upheaval is a very firm rejection of any kind of representation and political supervision, which resulted equally from failed past experiences, but also authoritarian persistent strategies, namely cooptation, infiltration, and the so-called cloning of movements and organizations. Thus, like in 2011, the Algerian Hirak is mainly carried by ordinary citizens. In the first phase of the movement, I think it's also interesting to underline that activists and members of political parties were even refraining from showing symbols or logos of their organizations during the demonstrations. Some of them have even been chased by the militias on saying, this is the people who is on the street, we don't need political organizations. So although this revolutionary moment was and is still experienced as a revelation, as a rupture, it would be misleading to speak of an awakening. So in 2019 and later, we still heard the sentence, "Sahina," so we woke up. And I'm very skeptical about this idea of a narcoleptic population that suddenly woke up in 2019. Rather, I would argue that this current uprising is the result of an accumulation of struggles of previous decades. I would also like to stress that this upheaval is at the crossroad of different temporalities, among them the Arab revolutions. But indeed, by looking at the language of the revolt, at the slogans, the iconography, listening to the sound and soundtracks, but also to the repertoire of action of this revolution, informs us about the different political moments and political groups that form the Hirak, from the ultras chanting the misery of their lives, to and denouncing injustice, to melodies drawing on the rich tradition of Amazigh cultural and political resistance, to adapted slogans of the War of Independence and of the 2011 revolutions. A further characteristic of this revolutionary evil is its radicalism, as the evolution of slogans show. So in the first months, in the first 2 months, we heard mainly slogans rejecting, of course, the fifth mandate of Bouteflika, like ما كانش الخمسة بوتفليقة, so there will be no fifth mandate of Bouteflika, or Jumhuriya ماشي مملكة, Algeria is a republic, not a monarchy. And those also denouncing corruption and crony capitalism, like كليتوا البلاد يا سراقين, you ate the country, O thieves. They rapidly evolved into demands for a radical change of the political system. And this can be seen in slogans like الشعب يريد, and then the Algerian adaptation, الشعب يريد يتنحوا كاع, people want them all to leave. Or الشعب يريد يتحاسبوا كاع, we want them all, or the people want them all to be judged. Especially after the chief of staff, Ahmed Gaid Saleh, forced the president Bouteflika to leave, the Hirak's main demand revolved around a complete reshuffling of the political system, especially concerning the role of the army, which has been at the core of the political decision-making since independence. So after April 2019, one of the main slogans was دولة مدنية ماشي عسكرية, we want a civil state, not a military one, and جزائر جمهورية ماشي كازرنة, Algeria is a republic and not a barrack. This radicalism is on the one hand surprising, in the sense that it stands in contrast to the reluctance of 2011 that I described before, of large portions of the population to engage in a mobilization against the regime. Yet on the other hand, it also inscribes itself in the continuity of a radical political imaginary that is inherited by the War of Liberation, commonly named Thawra, that functions as the founding myth of the post-colonial nation. Thus, this upheaval is framed as the continuation of the War of Independence against the French colonial rule. I don't know if some of you had the opportunity to read Jamila Bouhirat's letter. She's inscribing herself in this continuity. So this does not only resonate with the political imaginary associated with courage and a strong sense of sacrifice and solidarity, but also evokes promises of emancipation, freedom, social justice, and dignity. Using the memory is also a strong strategy for countering constant allegations of foreign intervention, of foreign manipulation, the so-called Yad al-Kharijiyya that was also a dominant trope back in. So framing this upheaval in the continuity or as an accomplishment of the liberation movement can be seen in uncountable reference to figures of the War of National Liberation on slogan and on signs, but also in the presence of former female veterans like Jamila Bouhirat, with her symbolic capital, who bodily incarnates the continuity of the struggle for popular sovereignty. And finally, the slogan, "Sha'b yurid al-istiqlal," the people want independence, which became hegemonic after 5th of July 2019, indicates a will to reconnect the promises of emancipation with the promises of emancipation, dignity, social justice, and freedom. Furthermore, slogans that resonate during the diverse demonstrations like "Pouvoir assassin," murderous regime, "Oulesh smahoulesh," no forgiveness in Tamazight, or "Jazair hurra demokratiya," free democratic Algeria, but also stadium songs are all an indication of their embeddedness in past struggles, as they mobilize a historical and emotional memory of popular revolts, like the Black Spring of 2001, which stands for the struggle for social justice and the recognition of Amazigh identity, also the struggle for democracy and human rights in the 90s. So indeed, even before the 2019 uprisings, the Algerian contentious space was characterized by a large repertoire of contention. I won't go into detail, we can discuss it later, what types of social movements were typical for this period. But I think what is important to understand is that these previous instances of overt protest, either by ordinary citizens or activists, or of covert defiance in the form of discursive questioning of authorities through humors, through songs, among other in football stadiums, practices of quiet encroachment, but also to different extents, contributed to moments of politicization among groups and individuals, to moments of reflection on its own place in the political process, to the circulation of themes, of repertoires, of framing, and to a certain point, to the moving of red lines. So undeniably, this movement of 22nd of February acted like a catalyst and unleashed a liberation and a conversion of long conclude. So although until now, no proper transition political process has readjusted its civilian facade through the election of Abdelmajid Tebboune in December 2019, and still aims at weakening the popular movement by engaging in a narrative of reform while sharpening repression. So although no political process, a transition process has been really launched, we still can say that the battle between state and society is still ongoing, although it has been put into parentheses because of the corona pandemic. And I think we should be attentive to ongoing transformation processes at the societal level and at the level of subjectivities. So as the Libyan writer Hisham al-Mattar stated back then in 2011, it's not only the political landscape that changed, but also the landscape of the self, we can see that the Hirak movement initiated a reconciliation process among Algerian citizens and with themselves. So among them as a societal level, but also at the individual level. This reconciliation process among the society, whose social ties have been challenged by a fratricidal war in the 90s, but also by authoritarian policies of knowledge production, aiming at installing distrust among citizens and the instrumentalization of ethno-linguistic conflicts between Arabs and Berbers, for example, has to be conceived as a non-linear process, which is imbued with tensions linked to issues of gender, class, and ideology. Thus, the mere fact of acting together at such a broad scale seemed unconceivable weeks before, even weeks before the uprising. And now we witnessed a celebration of the notion of people, a celebration of fraternity, a celebration of solidarity, which is visible in slogans like Les Algériens Khawa Khawa, Algerians are brothers, and I hope also sisters. As to the reconciliation with a picture of the self, it is expressed through the joy of having recovered its dignity, to reconnect with its revolutionary history and identity, like the song Mazalna Thouar, We Are Still Revolutionaries, chanted by the feminist blog shows. As it had been mentioned earlier, the uprising constitutes a rupture with previous contentious practices, but also created new types of sociability through practices of intense solidarity, like sharing water, food, protect care during demonstrations, but also during the corona pandemics. It contributed to the deconstruction of a certain amount of the idea of the self, like Orientalistic tropes of being either apathetic citizens or inherently violent subjects. The upheaval unleashed a dynamic of monetization of the society, a reconciliation with the political practice. Several collectives have been created at the level of universities, at the level of the feminist movement, and among ordinary citizens, notably in the fight against repression. Especially in the first of the uprising, we observed the emergence of new initiatives that allowed to create or to recreate social ties through, for example, public debates and citizen assemblies called Agora, who enabled participants to rediscover each other again as citizens, to exchange ideas about the ongoing process, and to discuss future ideas on different societal models. Artists gave a content to the chants, البلاد بلادنا ونديرو راينا, this country is ours and we do what we want, when they reappropriated public spaces by reciting poetry, performing popular theater, or by singing. So, in conclusion, what do we think of this? I hope I was not too quick by going through this year and a half of uprising, but I think that while reflecting about what has been said and looking at the dynamics of the Algerian uprising, I think it shows us that a processual approach to politics and to revolution, as well as a heuristic perspective that looks below the regime level and employs a broader understanding of what change means actually beyond regime change, is fruitful in order to grasp and take into account substantial changes at the societal level and on the level of subjectivities that might have long-term effects on the relation of the citizen with themselves, but also with the state. Beyond the local specificities of the Algerian case, looking at the language of revolt, looking at the imaginaries and the moral economies that are performed, we see that this uprising inscribes itself in a global dynamic of struggles for the enactment of popular sovereignty, true citizenship, and an equal and social and political order. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Naoual. It's brilliant. Thanks a lot.